Hi everyone! So in today's video we're going to look at how we can classify organisms within an ecosystem, and we're also going to continue the conversation about how energy is moved through ecosystems from producers to herbivores and then predators. In an ecosystem, energy originates from the sun and is then converted to sugars by producers. Producers are consumed by herbivores, herbivores are consumed by carnivores, and so on. That kind of process continues throughout the ecosystem. So the levels of organisms consuming one another are called trophic levels, and then we have some classifications for these different organisms. So at the very bottom or the base of a food chain or a trophic pyramid are producers. They are the autotrophs, the organisms that can do photosynthesis, that can make their own sugars, and they're the foundation of a food chain. As we move up from producers, so if we're looking at this diagram here, we have producers at the base, and then everything above them is considered a consumer. So consumers are heterotrophs. That means they obtain energy by consuming other organisms. And the primary consumers, these are our herbivores, followed by our secondary consumers. Those are carnivores and omnivores. They're animals that primarily eat other consumers. So these consumers will eat primary consumers. And then tertiary consumers are our top or apex predators. So apex predators, they're animals that eat secondary consumers or carnivores and omnivores. So when we look at a food chain, which is what we're going to start by looking at today, the arrows in a food chain always point from what is being eaten towards the thing that is eating it. And that is showing that energy is moving from one organism up to the other. So this zebra, yes, is eating grass, but the grass is providing energy to the zebra. So energy is being moved from the grass to the zebra. And then the same thing happens from the zebra to the lion. So some organisms actually exist in multiple trophic levels. These are our omnivores. So omnivores is the word right here. But omnivores can be both primary and then secondary or tertiary consumers. So for example, we have grizzly bears, which will eat fish, and they'll also eat things like berries. Then we also have an interesting example like a Venus flytrap. That's actually a producer and a secondary consumer, because it's a producer. It can do photosynthesis and make its own sugars, and it also consumes insects like flies. Each trophic level eventually produces dead individuals and waste products, and these things have to be broken down in order to return nutrients back into the environment. So they're broken down by scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers. These organisms are essential to cycling of nutrients because they help to break down organic matter and return it to the environment so that it can be used again. So really, these organisms complete the cycling of organic matter. So these three do slightly different things. Scavengers are things like turkey vultures, which we have a lot of around here. They consume dead animals. Then we have detritivores, which are also worms, but they break down dead tissues and waste products. Another example is dung beetles. And then we have decomposers, which are things like fungi and bacteria that convert organic matter into smaller elements and molecules. And those decomposers are really important because they take that dead organic material. So if some organism dies, whether that be a plant or an animal, decomposers will break it down at a molecular level into smaller elements, and that is what gets recycled back into the ecosystem. Along a similar line, food chains are very important when we're thinking about our biogeochemical cycles, so our carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and hydrologic cycles, because chemicals such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and then molecules like water are cycled from producers to consumers and then back through those scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers and released back into the environment. So one really big idea about this is that matter and energy are conserved throughout this process. So what that means is there is no new matter or energy created when it's moving from producers to consumers and things like that, but its form is changed. So for example, when we have a tree that dies, that tree is made up of organic material. It's made up of a lot of glucose, and glucose again is that C6H12O6 molecule. So when that tree dies, our detritivores come in, break down those molecules, and release carbon into the environment, into the soil and atmosphere, and then also release other nutrients back into the soil and atmosphere. So those molecules, like for example, carbon, the same amount of carbon will exist when the tree is alive and after it dies. It's just broken down by detritivores into smaller components, basically. It exists in these big molecules and it's broken down into things like carbon dioxide. So then energy is also conserved in these situations. For example, our sun's rays are light energy. As that light energy hits plant leaves, they convert it into glucose using the process of photosynthesis, and glucose is a form of chemical energy. So we're not losing energy, it's being converted to different forms. So this has to do with the first law of thermodynamics, which is a review from physical science if you took physical science, or chemistry definitely, but energy is never created or destroyed. So our biogeochemical cycles are an example of conservation of matter because we have things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water that are being converted into different forms, but the actual number of those atoms is not changing. And then food webs demonstrate conservation of energy. So when a rabbit eats a leaf, the energy from that leaf, which is in the form of glucose, is then transferred to the rabbit and stored as body tissues like fat and muscle. So that energy is still there, it still exists, it's not being created or destroyed, but as we were talking about earlier, it gets converted into different forms. So like from light energy from the sun to chemical energy in the form of glucose. Another big idea is that each time energy is transferred, so when it's transferred from producers to herbivores to other secondary consumers, some of that energy is lost as heat. So 100% of that energy from plants does not get passed on to herbivores. A lot of it, about 90% or more, is lost as heat or used up for the organism's own functioning. So as you move up a food chain, there's less energy available for organisms, which means that we're going to have fewer organisms as you move from one trophic level to the next. So a trophic level is our producers, our herbivores or our primary consumers, and then our secondary and tertiary consumers. So in food webs, we think about this as the amount of usable energy decreases as you move up the food chain. So we're not losing energy, or it's not being destroyed, but some of it, so we are losing it, but it's not being destroyed. Some of that energy is lost. It's not usable by organisms anymore because it's released into the environment as heat, or other ways it's used up by organisms to help them move, to aid in their development. So only some of that is actually usable for the next trophic level above. For example, if we're looking at the savanna ecosystem, we've got hundreds of millions of plants in that ecosystem. Then we have just millions of primary consumers. So those are things like our wildebeest in the bottom and gazelles. And then we have far fewer secondary consumers, so things like cheetahs and lions. So as you move up the food chain, less organisms can exist at each level. So we know that we lose a substantial amount of energy as we move up the food chain, and that can be displayed in what's called a trophic pyramid. So what we have in this diagram here is an example of a trophic pyramid. But these pyramids are really good for visualizing this energy loss because we can see that at the base of this pyramid, it's a wide base because we've got lots of plants, lots of primary producers, and they have quite a bit of energy available there. Then as you move up, 90% of that energy is lost as heat. So we have a smaller number of organisms that can exist at this level, and we also have a smaller amount of energy. And then as you move up even further, secondary consumers, there's less of them and they have less energy available to them. And then when we're talking about our tertiary consumers or our apex predators, we have even less energy and even less organisms. So that's why we use this pyramid shape to discuss food webs and food chains. But this loss of energy is also kind of encapsulated by a rule called the 10% rule. This says that in trophic pyramids, only about 10% of the energy from one level actually makes it to the next level. The other 90% is used by the organism and lost as heat. So in this diagram, I don't want this to confuse you. As we remember from our video on primary productivity, only about 1% of incoming sunlight or solar energy is actually captured by plants. So this 100% in this diagram is just showing that that is 100% of the energy available to plants. So then as we move up, 90% of that is lost as heat, 10% continues and can be used by primary consumers, and they gain that energy by eating primary producers. So then as you go up again, 90% of that 10% is lost, and we have 10% that moves on. But if we're looking at our initial 100%, that's only 1% of what we originally had. So this rule also applies for biomass. So biomass is the amount of just material that we have, amount of living material, basically. So when we have plants, a lot of biomass is supported because they have a lot of energy. They have 100% of the energy available to primary producers that they can use to grow, whereas primary consumers have less energy, so there are less organisms there. So less organisms, less living things with mass, less biomass. So we can use this 10% rule to actually do some calculations and figure out how much biomass and energy is present in each trophic level. And so again, those trophic levels are producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. The way that we can calculate the biomass of each trophic level and the energy present in each trophic level is just by multiplying by 10% as you move up to the next trophic level. So when you go from producers to primary consumers, you multiply by 0.10, that's our 10%. To go from primary consumers to secondary consumers, you multiply by 0.10, and from secondary to tertiary 0.10. So multiplying by 10% each time. If you wanted to make a bigger jump, instead of going from just one trophic level to the one right next to it, like if you want to go from producers all the way to tertiary consumers, you just have to take whatever your original number is, multiply it by the number of levels. So we have 1 level increase, 2 level increase, 3 level increase. So you multiply by 10% 3 times. So 1, 2, 3 for those 3 jumps from our producers. Okay, and another way you can do this, if you can keep it kind of organized in your brain, is just by moving decimal points. So I'll show you how to do that first with biomass. So if we have a biomass of 8,000 kilograms at the producer level, and we want to see how much is at the primary consumer level, you can move the decimal place over once to the left. So we have a decimal point right here. This is the same thing as multiplying by 10%, but you just move it over 1, and then our primary consumers have a biomass of 800 kilograms. See how we moved? There's 3 places now when there was 4 before. So you can also just write it out if that makes more sense to you. It doesn't matter to me, and the AP or College Board won't care either way, so you can do it however you like and whatever saves you some time. So again, if we're going from producers to primary consumers, you're taking the biomass of the producers and multiplying it by 10%. So 8,000 kilograms multiplied by 10%, and that gives us 800 kilograms. For secondary consumers, we take our value for primary consumers and multiply it by 10%. So 800 kilograms for our primary consumers times 10% equals 80 kilograms. And then finally, for our tertiary consumers or our apex predators, we take our biomass of our secondary consumers and multiply it by 10%. and we're left with 8 kilograms for our tertiary consumers. So you can do that again by moving the decimal place, or you can write it out, whatever suits you best and makes the most sense in your brain. So that was for biomass. We can do the same thing for energy. So we have 95,000 joules, and joules is a unit of energy in our producer level. If we want to figure out the primary consumer value, we would just take that 95,000 joules and multiply it again by 10%. And that would give us 9,500 joules at our primary consumer level. And you can continue doing the same thing, multiplying by 10% to get all the way to the top. Thus far, we've been talking about food chains, which are a linear representation of the flow of matter and energy. So that means we're moving from one thing to the next. So at the bottom, we have a food chain moving from grass to grasshopper, grasshopper to frog, frog to snake, and snake to eagle. But in reality, things are not quite that simple. So a much more realistic way to represent the interactions of different organisms and the flow of energy is with a food web. So a food web is made up of 2 or more interconnected food chains. So it's not just one linear representation. It's actually many interconnected organisms. And it kind of shows the complexity of these interactions a little bit better. So then the last thing to talk about today is what are called feedback loops. Basically, we have many species that are interconnected in a food web, and that means that if one species experiences some change, whether that's a population increase or a population decrease, that can impact other organisms. So for example, if we look at this diagram to the upper right, if our population of lions were to grow, that would dramatically reduce the number of gazelles. So the gazelles population would decrease, and then what would happen there is if we don't have as many gazelles, our grasses would be able to increase. Those populations would increase because less gazelles are eating the grass. So in this situation, the increase in lion population has a negative feedback loop when related to gazelles, because our gazelles would be negatively impacted, their population would decrease, and our grasses would have a positive feedback loop. So lions increase, and that also causes grasses to increase. Now that's not necessarily a direct effect, it's actually an indirect effect, but it still causes positive feedback from that initial lion population increase. So when we have the removal or addition of a top predator or an apex predator, that has a ripple effect down throughout all the trophic levels, and this is called a trophic cascade. So when you have something happening at the top of our trophic level and it causes effects throughout the entire trophic pyramid, we call it a trophic cascade. So for example, in the bottom, if we have a declining wolf population, we will have an increase in deer population, and that will lead to overgrazing and the decline of trees. So this is a trophic cascade because the loss of these wolves has an impact on the trophic levels below. So the herbivores or primary consumers as well as the primary producers. And here is your practice FRQ for this last video in Unit 1. I want you to explain why a relatively large forest can only support a small number of wolves. I want you to do a calculation like I showed you earlier. I want you to describe, when we're looking at this food web up here, describe one effect that would happen if our frog population were to decline. And then I also want you to identify an organism in this food web that is both a secondary and a tertiary consumer.